Welcome to Never Rewrites. I'm Isaac Askew.
And I'm Jeffrey Sherman. And today we're going to discuss interviewing, or the hiring process. So, the genesis of this episode is that Isaac and I are looking for new jobs. No, wait.
Wait, what? I hope my boss doesn't hear this episode.
No, we are not looking for new jobs. We are happy where we are. We do know, though, however, that it is January when we are recording this. Lots of people change jobs at the beginning of the year because they get their annual bonuses and they leave. There's also lots of layoffs, unfortunately, in the tech industry. Google just laid off a bunch of people. I'm sure all of our listeners, all of our many, many listeners from Google are sad. Maybe we have one. Um, so it's a great time to talk about interviewing and the good, the bad. So I thought I would take a swing at it uh, first. And I'm going to say that as an interviewer, like somebody who has done a lot of interviews, one thing that I find can really make and break an interview and really just the whole candidate experience. Please read the resume before you walk in the room. Uh, I have
Hmm.
I've been on the other side of the table where it's clear the other person never saw my resume before they sat down, and they spend a couple minutes in awkward silence reading it to figure out what questions they want to ask, totally unprepared. And I have been somewhat on the other. Well, I try to always make sure I've read the resume. I did one time mix up my interviews, and I walked in with the wrong resume, so I was unprepared because I had my afternoon's interview, and or sorry, I was interviewing two people, and I was prepared for the wrong one.
Got it. Yeah.
So nobody is perfect, but just be ready. Have read the resume, scan it again, circle all the typos, and
No.
but always come into the room prepared.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
are remember that it is as much they are interviewing you and your company as you are interviewing them. You are not some lord offering them the possibility of becoming a serf and being tied to the company. Like it's a two-way street.
It's interesting you bring up the resume thing because I've definitely been guilty of not reading the resume.
Hmm.
Not that I didn't care about the person in particular, but it was almost like a separation of concerns for me in my role in hiring, where like they've already been vetted and they've already made it through to the process where they want to pull me in. And in general, I'll glance over like, okay, here's the technologies they know. Like as an engineer, here's the
So
tech
what is
stack
the
they know about.
role that you're in? You're the closer. You're the Iceman. You're there to kill them.
No, they it's almost like for me they'll bring me in to like dig a bit further into some of the details and technologies that they've worked with. So if it's a front end person, they might pull me in to be like, all right, it says here that they worked with Vue and Next.js and React. Can you ask them questions kind of related to that, or give them some kind of hypothetical in which they can still talk about the experience, but then go into detail about the work that they've done enough that you know that they kind of know what they're talking about. So it's a mixture of that, and then sometimes what we'll do is give them like if it's a front end, again, a front end position, maybe pull up a page that's slow and ask
Hmm.
them, how would you start debugging this? That way you're not using like a contrived question that people could just download or chat GPT and answer to or things like that. You know, it's like here's just a random page we've got. You know, we had some troubles with this page. How would you go about it? And just like completely spitball a brand new problem nobody would have run across before. And so that's
Hmm.
kind of it's more of a it's like a mixture of culture fit to see how I like working with them, to get them to talk about their problem out loud, and to like explore some of the technologies they've claimed. So I just need like a little bit of snippets from the resume. I don't need to see every position and how they've climbed the career ladder. And or I mean I could, but it doesn't impress me, and that's not generally what I'm going for in the end. I'm
Right.
going for, can I work with you, and are you bullshitting about how much experience you've really got and the things that you've listed.
Yeah. Speaking of resumes, people, it's one page per decade of experience, rounded down, or you know, rounded down. Well, I guess you
I hate
one
resumes.
like uh, I've seen people with 3 years experience in a 10-page resume, and I was floored because I had
Right.
uh, I guess
People are so picky about that too, though, because they even go, if it's more than one page, I just throw it right in the bin. I've heard that before too. Like you're supposed to put everything into one easy to digest page, or you're just not even considered. It's kind of wild.
I mean it's a good idea to put everything in one easy to digest page, but I've never binned somebody's resume because it was too long.
Yeah.
Well, I have binned it because I read it and it was too long, but I did not bin it because I didn't cite unread, throw it away because
Yeah.
yeah. Yes. Also, don't put anything on your resume that you don't want to talk about.
That's a good one.
Uh, I've I've encountered this one repeatedly where people have worked at interesting places and you will ask and they're like, "Oh, I don't want to talk about that." And I'm not
Yeah.
talking like recently, like they worked at Enron
Hmm.
15 years ago. This was like 2005, so this is like 10 years before. Like they worked at Enron 10 years before it imploded. Like not at the very frothy end. And like, oh, I don't want to talk about Enron.
Frothy.
And it's like, oh, okay. Like
Yeah, I think
you don't need like every job you've ever had all the way back to school.
right. Well, that's the thing too. Like I used to have C++ listed on my resume, and it was
Hmm.
there because I had to study C++ and Java a lot in college. And once I got a job outside of college, and for 10 years after, I touched Java very only recently, and I've never touched C++ in my professional career. Actually, it was like we used it so much in 4 years of schooling, but I
Hmm.
didn't actually have a job that used it enough. And then I was asked about it one time because it was on my LinkedIn for a long time because it used to be something I could talk about. And I realized it had been so long that I was like, I should just take this off my resume. Maybe I should do a little bit of cleanup and take away some things that were so old it's not really relevant, like you're talking about. Just leave it off. You
Right.
could have you can have your LinkedIn profile that talks about maybe your history of doing things, and then your resume, not necessarily based off your LinkedIn profile, but a resume is like a shorter uh, snippet of that goes into the relevant details that are like tailored to the position you're trying to get.
Right. Your resume is not your whole life job history.
Yeah.
It is relevant job history to the position that you're applying for. Uh, Last time I was actually actively doing the blind, searching for a job type thing, I had 3 or 4 versions of my resume
Same.
where I, was highlighting different things and I removed different things. And that's just how you do. Like, as an example, I did a lot of I did a lot of ASP
Hmm.
in the early aughts, and I didn't want to do it anymore, so I took it off my resume.
Fair. Yeah. I've done that. Like, actually, for my current job, I'm a principal role currently, but I applied for principal at the time, and I was a senior at the job prior, and I
Hmm.
kind of applied for it, hoping I could, you know, or I was almost like seeing, am I at principal level at where they're at? Because everybody's got their different senior L1, L2, L3. Maybe I was a principal L1, here, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
So I was like, all right, let me call myself principal and see, let me make a principal looking resume for things I've done at that level. I had a senior level that I did for a different company. One was a tech lead. The role was just
Mm.
called a tech lead, and I had led teams before. So I was like, okay, well, let me talk about experiences where I worked with, product managers or customers to get things across the line and things that are not things you normally talk about maybe in an engineer perspective because it's not technically, they can be related, but like you would definitely want to highlight that communication and working as a team more in the tech lead role than you would just an individual contributor role. So I guess it's still kind of NIC, but you know what I mean? There's a little bit of crossover in like the how much you work with other people versus roles where you can just purely be head down if you wanted to.
Yeah, the idea of just reframing. not even reframe, but just tell different stories or talk about different experience depending upon the role. Like a senior dev is a hands-on role where it's the last rung where you are still supposed to mostly do what they tell you. And
Hmm.
if you move up to the lead, principal, staff, those levels, you're either supposed to be hunting up your own work uh, or being in touch with the leadership to understand and reshape it. And so if you're trying to make that jump, you should definitely you should reshape your resume around times and instances where you changed the dynamic of, you didn't just do something that was technically hard. You realized that the thing that needed to be done had to be done,
Right.
or that you
Yeah,
saw
yeah,
it
yeah.
through to delivery or something.
Got it. Well, that's. I feel like we could split this into a couple of long running conversations, but there's one I want to
Yeah,
get to in our
go
current
for it.
one, and that's basically the interviewing process. So
Okay.
after the resume looks fine, you made it past whoever's preferences for how long your resume should be, and you match everything, or you do whatever that the criteria is for like finding the different keywords that are in your resume, and it filters through for you in an automated sense. You make it past all that. They want to get you in and start talking to you. Um, I feel like there's a ton of frustration in this particular phase of the process, and there's a lot we can go into. So I'm going to list off a couple of things, and maybe you can stop me at some. Um, but one of them is the length of this process, how long it takes, how many different interviews you have to go through to
Mm.
get to the end to finally get your offer. People not discussing before you start this 8 hour, 5 day process, however long it is. People not discussing salary like beforehand. Like just tell me what the band is before I even begin this process, like so I don't waste my time. They might give it to you later or ask for your salary expectations, like on the second person you talk to.
Oh
Uh,
god, yeah, never flash the kimono first. Um, yeah, you going back a step.
mm-hmm.
They should be, as an interviewer, you should be very upfront about what the process looks like. You know, what's your company's timeline? What's the, how many interviews rounds is it usually? How long are the rounds?
Yeah,
You should be fair. Is there going to be a take home assignment? You should be upfront about all that. And salary is a hard one
mm-hmm.
because it's this terrible power dynamic, and I've never been a good salary negotiator, but you definitely don't want to uh, give the first answer unless you're gonna do something absurd and anchor high. Be like, oh, $1
Yeah.
million. dollars.
For sure. Like you want to give, because it only hurts you. Like if you pitch a number that you think is reasonable, and they're like, "Oh, we were going to pay him like 50K more than that," then like, they want to pay you as least as possible because they're trying to get the role filled, but they're not trying to spend all their money.
Right. And just FYI, it is now illegal in many states to ask the candidate what their previous compensation was.
Yeah, I heard it phrased these days as like, "What's your expectations? What are your
Right.
expectations around salary?" Clever way to
Well,
kind of
they
get
can ask
around
your
that,
expectations.
right?
They can't
Which
ask what did you earn at your last job.
But yeah, that's just their veiled way of kind of hinting at that. What are your expectations? Like essentially, what are you currently making? Or it gives you
Right.
the opportunity to be like, well, I'm currently making X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
Now suddenly they've got the same answer.
Right. Yes. So I guess the advice here is do not tell people what you are currently making.
Yeah,
Uh, if they push hard, give an absurd number like, oh, $1 million total comp sounds fine, but we could discuss the particulars depending upon how you want to structure the package.
well, if you don't, then what do you do instead? If someone says, what are your salary expectations, or tries to find that number from you, you'd be like, oh, just whatever market value is these days. Like what would you do?
I would anchor high, so I might go with, oh, $1 million a year sounds fair, and obviously no one pays $1 million a year. Even in the glory days of a few years ago, when people were making $1 million at Facebook and Google, that would be a combination of like 200,000 in cash and
RSUs
800,000
and
in
stuff. Yeah.
stock paid out over 5 years. So yeah, $1 million cash, everyone knows, is not a thing. So you could, and when you say anchor high, what you're trying to do is set expectations that you're going to be expensive because you deserve it and
Mm-hmm.
you're worth it. But you also don't want to. You're just throwing out an anchor. You're trying to pull the conversation to the high end, and hopefully they will laugh and they'll be like, "Ah ha ha, give me a real number." And then you say, "Well, I gave you a number. You give me a number."
You think that'll work? I've never tried this before. I think next time I will.
Uh, I recommend. So Cynical 101.
Mm-hmm.
In a previous episode, I know we talked about taking interviews as a way to get experience.
Yes, it's very good.
So again, if you take an interview to get experience and they are getting to the job offer stage, this is a great, and you don't want the job. This is a great time to work on your negotiating skills.
That's true. Yeah. I know HackerX in Chicago, they hold it's like a speed dating, or I don't know if they changed the format, but it used to be like a speed dating for like companies. And you
Mm-hmm.
would basically sit down for 5 minutes and talk to uh, an employer and say, "This is who I am," and you basically convince them, to hire you. And it was a way to kind of like quickly meet a bunch of people. You just as soon as the buzzer sounds, you go to the next table and you just see if it even
Mm-hmm.
stick, that kind of thing. And it was a very fun power dynamic because I went there years ago, when I lived in Chicago and I had a job, and they'd always be like, why do you want to work for us? And I was like, no, 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 no. You convinced me to work for you. Like, what are your benefits? Tell me about the job and like that kind of thing. Because it was really nice in those positions when you do have a job, or if you're not even looking around, to be invited to a place like HackerX to
Mm-hmm.
do just that. Talk to somebody, practice that, talk about salary expectations, all the things you might not be able to do if there was a power dynamic of I need money in a job right now because I've been laid off. You had all this practice beforehand.
Right. Practice is wonderful. The power dynamic is wonderful. That's even if what you're doing is nothing more than taking recruiter calls,
Mm-hmm.
where they're going to talk to you about the position. You say, "Well, what does the position pay?" And they'll say, "Oh, well, it depends on experience." And you say, "Okay, what are the bands?" And again, these cases where you don't actually care what the answer is, what you need to do, what you're working on, is getting confident
Yeah.
in asking the question.
Right. Okay.
But yes, if after the anchor high at $1 million, uh, and if they kept pushing like, "Oh, ha ha, be serious," and like, "Oh, well, you throw me something, I threw you something," I might then start quoting, "Well, I'm sure you're not paying as well as Google, but Google is paying this for this level, for the level of work I do."
Yeah. I could throw some rationale around what your maybe somewhat exorbitantly high salary is. 300K because Google's paying that, and you like see what they say.
Right? Yeah, Google. I think that they're paying like 250 plus a ton of options.
Mm-hmm.
You're not Google, so I don't expect you to give me that level of insane options. Plus, you're probably not public. But like, what do you just keep going back to? Here's examples of other companies that pay very well, and the packages are structured in various different ways. So again, what does your package look like?
Yeah.
Like, if you're going to offer me stock, okay, that's worth. It's like counterfeit money. It's not worth nothing, but it's not worth the face value either, unless it's
Right.
public and you can sell it.
All right. I've got another pet peeve. Have we
Uh,
talked about salary enough? You want to
I,
move
I
to the
think
next
we've
one?
burned it to the ground.
Great. Next one. Coding challenges. This might be a controversial one.
So I
Yeah.
used to be a big fan of coding challenges. I used to be a big fan of take-home assignments.
Mhm.
And I think I'm at a point in my career where I would only do it if I was up hard up against the wall and I needed money.
Yeah.
But I think at this point in my career, if you said, oh, we're going to do a coding challenge or a coding assignment, the professionalism in me says I wouldn't abort an interview, like an active interview, if they sprung it on me.
Yeah, sure.
But if I knew it was coming, I would probably turn it down.
Yeah. I think for me, it depends on the challenge, really. Because I
Hmm.
mentioned one that was kind of one a moment ago. Like, whenever I was saying, here's a slow page, what would you do to fix it? It's not
Oh,
necessarily
that's
coding.
that's not a
It's,
coding challenge to me. But okay.
yeah, let me go further into it. That one's not necessarily coding per se, but it still involves them, like, sharing their screen and, showing their terminal, or showing, inspecting Google Inspector, and, like, what kind of network tab they would use to see if the network was slow, and that's why the page was slow, and things like that kind of still get more into that kind of that similar vein of things. And for me, those are a bit more genuine. Where
Mm-hmm.
it gets tacky is the FizzBuzz level things and the leak code level things and the
Right.
how to ace the programming interview, solve Fibonacci or Towers of Hanoi things. If someone asks me, invert a binary tree, all these kind of things that, like, are absolutely not indicative of the role that you'll be doing at your current job. Like, if
Mm-hmm.
they need to hire somebody and scale a team up because they're having some particular problem and they don't have the resources, they're trying to scale something up, they're trying to fix a particular problem you might be good at, and then they hit you with solve Fibonacci for me in a recursive way, and while everyone's, like, watching you, because you might be being interviewed, and you've got 20 minutes, and, like, the rest of the 30 minutes we're going to be asking you questions, but you got 20 minutes to think about this, and you're like, completely, like, again, it's a waste of time for me, because you could sit there and try to solve it, and even if you were really good at solving it because you remember it from school, it doesn't say much about whether you can actually do the job. And even if you can't solve it because you don't remember the easy way to do it, it's completely zero analysis into how good of a problem solver you might be, related to SaaS problems that you've been working on for a decade, and not, these kind of things.
Right. I think the somebody made a comment that I heard somewhere along the way. Sorry to whoever it was, I don't remember. But they said, those leet code hacker rank type problems are a not very subtle way to discriminate against uh, older programmers, because the people who remember that
Interesting.
stuff
Yeah.
cold are the people who just got out of college or have time to study, or the very very few people who actually use that stuff in their day-to-day work. And
Yeah.
if you aren't in that group, right, it's how much work are you going to put in? Because I remember I took a few shots at trying to get in Google, and I spent 30, 40 hours studying.
Yeah.
And, that's not, I mean, that's 34, that's a week's worth of work to try and pass a test. And, in retrospect, I'm sorry I spent that much time on it.
Yeah. I applied for them years ago, and I remember one of the first questions they asked me. I thought I was being clever with it, because it was for Google,
Mm-hmm.
and they asked me what the big O notation of the quicksort algorithm was. I might have mentioned this on the previous episode too, and I didn't remember big O notation. I mean, I remembered big O notation from algorithms class in college, but I didn't remember the particular O notation for that algorithm off the top of my head. And I was, like, jokingly said I would probably Google it because I'm talking to Google, and I thought it'd be funny in the interview. But I was honest too, because, like,
Yeah.
yeah, I would just look it up, because why would you need to commit that to memory? You
Right. It's of no
wouldn't.
value.
It's of zero value. But they weren't impressed by that. They think, well, I
No.
think it was very funny. Like, they assumed that I would be able to, like, I'm such a computer scientist that I have memorized every single important figure. I've read every book. I can recite Sandy Metz and
Yeah.
Bob Martin, anything. It's kind of ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember. I know in one of the last ones I did, they asked me to, it was some mathematical thing. And I said, well, realistically, I wouldn't never do this because I would just use the standard library. But I'm going to assume that you're asking me not to use a standard
Right.
library
Yeah.
because for the purpose of talking about this. Um, but yeah, The techniques that I've seen that I think I'd still go for, um, and it's rare that I've seen this, but occasionally I have seen companies that have some discrete chunk of work and they'll pay you for it. Like
Oh, see, I do like
like
that. Yeah.
hey, here's our code or here's the data, and we need an algorithm to do this. And we think it'll take about a week. We'll pay you whatever, $5,000 or $2,000, and we'll own the work. And then we'll discuss, whether or not from that we'll discuss whether or not we want to hire you.
That's kind of a cool model.
And it's like,
Yeah.
okay,
No free work, that kind of
no
thing.
free
Yeah.
work. We expect the work to be work level, right? I guess a note of caution: if you are doing like a take-home assignment and you do it at work level, because whoever reads it is going to assume that your work is never going to be better than that.
Yeah.
So I've seen lots of candidates go down in flames because they just submitted terrible answers, like answers that were correct. They worked, but the code was so shitty that I was like, ugh, I can't imagine working with this person. The code is so wackadoodle.
Yeah. All right. So I think that. Oh, actually, one more thing before we move on. When we were in Oakland for a conference back
Mm-hmm.
in October,
Yep.
we encountered two hiring agencies. Basically, it was like a companies that would do vetting for you.
Mm-hmm.
They would vet the software programmers, and they would vet. They would give you challenges, like programming challenges. And I actually went up to them and talked to them, and they almost just assumed, like I said, we this is the problem we're solving. We know that you guys have issues with people cheating on their exams or cheating on their programming questions you give them. And I'm like, what a bold assumption. Like, well,
Yeah.
first of all, no, I don't think we have that problem. And they
No,
said,
you're at
oh,
the wrong
well,
conference.
yeah, yeah. I was like, I don't think we have that problem. And they're like, well, how do you prevent them from chat GPTing an answer to your question during the interview? And I'm like, well, we don't ask them questions that have been asked before, because they're thinking like if you're going to ask them like from a book of questions, like some people apparently some people will leak like Adobe's hiring process and the questions
Mm-hmm.
Adobe might ask. That gets on the internet, makes cycles, and you can download it and get prepared for the interview in advance. And I guess that's what they were trying to counter. And I'm like, we don't even do that. We don't even ask the same people the same questions at this company. We just we see what their experience looks like and craft an interview based on that on the spot. And it's not hard to do. But apparently, so many companies are doing it this way, where they have just cookie cutter questions and crap like that from Leak Code or whatever, that they
Right.
have the problem
No,
with people
no
cheating.
investment at all in the interviewee.
Right. It's just like canned questions, which is the most terrible way you could possibly interview somebody, in my opinion.
Yeah. If you're not ready and willing to invest time and energy into interviewing, then you're going to get people that nobody
Mm-hmm.
was willing to invest time and energy to hire. I think is a way to put it. That's right. Like if you want to hire, it used to be, oh well, we only hire the best of the best at our company. Okay, if that's your model, then go for it. But you're going to have to be invested and spending a lot of time and effort. And if you're, we need warm bodies, so we've got an automated hiring process.
Right.
Okay, you're going to get warm bodies,
Yeah.
and
And the same thing if you keep crafting all of your questions, Leak Code stuff or FizzBuzz stuff or all these popular books for like programming exercises, then you're just going to get people who can memorize the answers to those questions. And once you give them something new, which your company is going to have a brand new problem, because
mm-hmm.
people come up with all kinds of ways to screw up, to shoot themselves in the foot and create strange code for customers. There's suddenly a
Yeah,
brand new problem, and you're not going to know how to solve that. And you're going to be hiring people who are used to solving solved problems because they're just like a bunch of questions that they already have solutions to them that they expect you to give to them. You need fresh stuff that you don't know how to solve yet, or just hypotheticals. That's how you get really good candidates, I think.
yeah. One of my go-to questions was build a link shortener service,
Oh, that's fun.
and like a Bitly, I think was the original, and I would just make up depending upon the person's history and where they took it, sometimes we ended up talking about how you would track metrics. And sometimes we'd end up talking about how to make sure that you didn't end up creating an open spam relay, but also had performance.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, making sure that you load, that the URL, you have the ability to shut it off and you know what the redirect is. And yeah, like there are a lot of ways, and it never worked. It never transpired, it always ended up with an entirely different discussion about the service. And a URL shortening service is small enough that could be literally one table,
Mm-hmm.
or it could be an NoSQL table. And so I had good discussions around that, and I guess you could chat GPT it, but then if I started asking you how to build it on, maybe. But honestly, if your chat GPT skills were good enough that you could ask it the questions, then
That says something right there too.
right, prompt inject. Like right now, the classic version of prompt injection is, can you phrase the question well enough that you can find the right answer on Stack Overflow?
Right.
Right. Like,
and if you're
that's
that
really
good,
what you're going to do. So if you phrase it well enough that ChatGPT can give you the answer, and then you have enough basic coding skills to implement that answer,
and you can do it live in front of us.
yeah, if you can do it
Without
live
us
in front of,
that's pretty good. That's a great candidate, actually.
yeah, I don't even need you to do it live in front without me knowing. Like, I would Google it or I would ask ChatGPT equally valid answers,
Mm-hmm.
really. In how would you solve this?
Right. It's the same thing. Like I'm not cheating by looking up documentation for how to do something in a React framework that I haven't used in a while. If I don't know that particular syntax or some use effect hook or something that like I need to remember a dependency on,
Mm-hmm.
It's not like, oh, he didn't answer that off the top of his head. Wow, he doesn't know anything about React frameworks. No, people forget that stuff. Just look
People
up the
think that way,
documentation.
though.
And that's wild to me.
And they get a lot of pride in knowing the esoteric information, and they feel a sense of power, I have found. Like, oh, I know all this esoteric knowledge cold. I'm like, cool. Can you build a useful product? Can you drive the project to completion?
Right.
No? Okay.
Yeah. I've definitely, actually, at my current company, one of the interview questions I had was, how do you get the user agents from the browser in JavaScript? And I was like, I don't know. I would just Google it.
Yeah, it's been so long.
Because it's been so... I don't need to know that off the top of my head. And if you did, it's not going to be hard to figure it out and implement it. But I actually said that during the interview. And the people at my current company are great interviewers, and they laughed too. And they said that was probably what they would do as well. And we had a conversation about it, and we kept it going. But I've definitely been at companies where either those types of people who are like very prideful of the esoteric knowledge were interviewing me, or I've interviewed alongside people who are very picky, and they're like, they couldn't answer this really basic thing about, like, they didn't know how C compiled down into assembly. So they're not even computer scientists. Why would they be working at this company? And you're like, whoa. A lot of people don't know that kind of thing, or don't care to learn how to write compilers or build their own programming language. Just because you're good at that and you care about that doesn't mean it's going to help us at our current company. Like, take a chill pill.
Yeah, it almost certainly isn't.
Yeah. So I think that's actually a good thing to say to any interviewers out there. I think a good interviewer is somebody who can disarm the interviewee, the person they're trying to interview, so that they're not tense. They're not like, if you're tense and you're nervous, you can't answer questions quickly, even questions you know the answer to, because you're on the spot. You have like stage fright, and you're like, oh, and then later in the shower, you're like, oh, duh, that was, I couldn't think about it because everyone was staring at me. The same thing happens to a lot of people when you're put on the spot. Yeah. So you disarm them, make a conversation at it, have them talk a little about the history, and then once they get into something they're excited about, oh, I can see they're excited. Tell me more about that in a way that's not judgmental. Like, kind of pull it out of them, because you can see they've done a lot of good things, but don't hit them with a bunch of technological gotchas. You couldn't answer this one. That should be such a simple question. What's the first tag in an HTML document? They didn't know that. Who cares if they're a back-end engineer? Like, no one cares. You know, like people, like, obviously,
Even the browser
like
doesn't care.
True. Right? So, yeah, it may seem like, how would they not know that? That's like the first thing you learn, you know, but like, who cares?
If you
they
learn
can do
before
other
HTML.
things, that's fine. Right. Some people built stuff before HTML existed. Like, you know, that's fine. They're still just as valid as a computer scientist or a programmer or whatever. Yeah. So just like drop your own ego, I think would be a good lesson to the interviewee.
Yeah.
Viewer,
as an easy tactical tip for interviewers, have a schedule, like if you have an hour, right, just go walk in knowing that you're going to spend 5 minutes on I used to do a lot of interviews, and I still remember like my spiel, just, hey, this is who I am. I'm going to spend like 5 minutes talking to you about why the company is the best. And then I want to spend, 25, 30 minutes talking about all the, interesting things from your resume. And then I want to give it a pause and turn it around to let you ask me any questions you want, because I know that sometimes that takes a while. And then if any time remaining, we'll go back to discussing interesting things from your work history. And then I'd say, does that sound good? And so then, because later on, first of all, always make sure to leave time for people to ask you questions. That's another peeve of mine. If you don't let me ask questions, or you get annoyed at me asking questions, right? Like, I'm going to have to work with you, and I can guarantee you I will be one of the most on the high end of people who asks you questions.
Right.
So if this is a problem, let's nip this in the bud right now.
For sure.
But just, I don't want to make that jarring, like, oh, I've screwed up and they're done talking, asking me questions. I want to set the expectation that I'm going to ask them, I'm going to give them time for questions, but not for a bit. And two, when I make that switch, it's not jarring. Because I'll have it out there. Sometimes I'd even set a timer so that I wouldn't ever have to look at my watch. I just like set a timer. I'm like, oh, that timer means that it's now your turn to ask me questions until the end. And then if there's, also disarm them by saying, hey, maybe you won't have enough questions to fill it, and that's fine. Especially the later in the day you are.
Yeah. That's an interesting. I agree with all that. There's also something that I'm kind of thinking of now, which is like people who don't have questions to ask. Like you, at the very end of it, you said, "You have any questions for us?" And I'm like, "Nope, all good." And I guess there could be a few reasons for that. Because the first thing I was thinking was like I would almost always want them to have questions, because I think it's kind of weird if you're interviewing somebody and they don't have any questions about the role. Like either you did a really good job explaining everything that they're going to need to know there in like short time that you had, which is very unlikely, or they just are not really, they don't, or they don't care like as much. They really just want the job because they're just trying to pay the bills, which is actually kind of valid too. You don't need to love your job. Everyone kind of wants that of the person, but like sometimes the person really just needs a job and they don't really care as much about the job they're doing. They want to be a mercenary. I'm not really sure if that's valid or not. It feels like it should be valid either way, but I could also see a company wanting somebody who likes someone who's excited about their job, But I'm kind of I'm on the side of the little guy just trying to get a job.
Yeah, I don't hold it against anyone because I don't know what conversations they've ever had. Like, especially if I'm the last interviewer.
True.
A lot of questions either means that the other people did a bad job setting them up. They're they either did a bad job answering in the earlier ones. The person's just asking to ask.
Or they've answered.
They had a lot of
right.
But like a lot of times, if you're the last one, like I've just like, I know I've certainly said, I had a million questions for the first person, but at this point, I think I've got everything that I'm looking for.
That's a good thing too. Like now that I'm talking about it out loud, having empathy for that last interview. If someone doesn't have any more questions to ask or doesn't ask any for you, they might just be tired, man.
Yeah,
I would be totally tired. It's okay. Like I guess the more that I'm talking about it out loud during this podcast, the more I'm kind of like, it's okay, really, if they don't have questions, because there's plenty of reasons for them not to at that point.
Right.
Use context, I suppose, to figure out if you're okay with that.
Right. And I've worked at, or I've interviewed at places, I guess I actually worked at some, where like it was a technical screen, then probably an hour and a half long talk with a manager, and then they would bring you in for more technical interviews. So by the time I talked to the hiring manager for an hour and a half, I didn't really have general questions anymore.
Yeah. A couple of times I've definitely said to people, I know I've already mentioned this to blah, blah, so-and-so, but I'm going to ask the question again for you. You're like, so I guess it can get a little bit repetitive, even if you already have a list of intelligent questions to ask during your interview process. So, yeah.
Yes. But if you need a question, a good one to ask is something in the flavor of, what question should I have asked that I didn't think to ask?
You're saying,
or
like,
what question would you really have liked me to ask you? Yeah.
I feel like that would almost be something that you would do post, like if, as a follow-up email, like a thank you email, like, oh, I was just kind of curious. I only had a few questions to ask, and now I'm wondering what kind of questions would you have want me to ask? Or if they denied you and you were like, why did you deny me? Is there any questions you expected me to ask? Or something like that. Seems weird to bring it up during the interview, though.
Yeah.
Or at least I wouldn't.
Yeah, it's one of those, if you don't have anything, asking them what I should have asked or what would probably be the best thing to ask would be a good question. You got to make it natural. You got to ask a few people.
I guess so. I guess part of it almost feels like a cop-out, though. What questions do you want me to ask? Right?
No, it's more of like, if you were interviewing me for a role and at the end I was like, okay, so what technical questions should I have asked about how your technology is set up that I didn't know enough to ask about?
Oh, that's a good way to do it. I didn't know enough yet to ask good questions.
Yeah.
It's a better way to phrase it. All right. I do have one other thing that I think it might be interesting for the listener.
Okay, one more, and then I think we're running long. It's way more than 15 minutes.
It's okay. It's a good episode. One thing I really hate that I think you should do anyway is a follow-up email. I always thought it was really dumb, like a thank you email. It just seemed kind of like you're begging for the job, or a little, too much to me personally. I just thought it was cheesy. But almost everybody at every company I've worked at so far, that I was like, when we're on the round table at the end trying to talk about how good the candidate was, somebody inevitably was like, they sent this great follow-up email thanking us. They asked a couple more questions, and that was like a selling point for people. They're happy that you still engaged. And again, like for me, I was always like, I never even did that. I thought follow-up emails were silly, but now I'm kind of like, they might be silly to me, but just do it anyway. People really tend to appreciate that. Just do it.
I know that I got my first job out of college because I was the only one who sent a follow-up email.
Right.
And I don't think I sent many follow-up emails in the years after. So
it totally depends, but the safe side is just send the email. It's
right?
Even if it's something silly.
It shouldn't take you very long. It's the polite thing to do. And it can't hurt you.
Yeah.
I guess unless they hate polite people.
In which case you dodge the bullet.
You dodge the bullet.
All right. Okay. We've hit on the topic for quite a bit.
Yes.
Would love for, especially for this episode, I feel like that we touched on a lot of things that may be especially a little bit controversial, especially for hires. Elite code challenges and things like that are popular. So if anyone has any comments on that, we would definitely love comments. It's really easy to comment on this episode through Spotify. I don't know about through Apple Podcasts or whatnot, but we have it on YouTube as well, or just, somewhere. We'd love the feedback.
Yes. And if you want to come on and argue or discuss your company's hiring practices and why they're awesome, we'd be happy to have you on.
Or tell us when we're wrong. Well, everything we said here was actually wrong.
Yes. We'd love to have people on to tell us why we're wrong. We can take it. Awesome. Well, thank you all for listening. I'm Jeffrey Sherman.
And I'm Isaac Askew, and this is Never Rewrite.